Ok, olá todo mundo. Bom, então hoje dá início à disciplina de análise do domínio da UFRGS, e aí quando o pessoal do programa disse, olha, Thiago, você vai ter que dar disciplina online, eu falei, bom, tem coisas no online que a gente pode fazer, né, que a gente não consegue fazer presencialmente de forma mais fácil. E como análise do domínio, né, tem, de certa forma, do ponto de vista metodológico, aí, nos últimos anos, sido parte das minhas pesquisas, atreladas mais à questão metodológica, né, da análise do domínio. E eu falei assim, bom, então a gente consegue fazer algumas aulas abertas, né? Então aí na disciplina a gente vai ter duas, e aí já convidando as pessoas para a próxima, a gente vai ter hoje o professor Birger Hjørland, falando sobre análise de domínio, sobre classificação facetada, enfim, são várias as coisas que ele vai abordar na fala dele. A fala dele está baseada num texto que eu e ele vamos escrever sobre essas questões, e aí então, assim, a gente vai ter a fala dele, a gente vai ter uma interação aqui dos alunos da disciplina, né, que estão aqui entrando conforme eu estou falando com vocês, e é isso, tá? Então, eu já apresentando o professor Birger Hjørland, ele tem um mestrado em psicologia, um doutorado em ciência da informação, ele é professor emérito em organização do conhecimento do Departamento de Ciência da Informação da Universidade de Copenhague, né? E ele, além disso, né, então ele também é um membro do Scientific Advisory Council, né, o que hoje chama da ISCO Internacional. Ele é editor-chefe da enciclopédia em Organização do Conhecimento, que é uma das principais iniciativas da ISCO, né? Atrelado, digamos assim, não só a discutir temas importantes da organização do conhecimento, mas tem muito também ali textos que são base para a disciplina, como essa, né? E ele tem publicado, né? E em várias revistas internacionais, né? Ele continua muito produtivo, como sempre. E thank you, Birger. I did your presentation in Portuguese. You can go ahead and start your.
Okay, good afternoon. Professor Barros has invited me to give a presentation about domain analysis for you, and I'm very happy to accept that. I have no slides, but I have prepared a paper, and if any, and I'm of course referring to some bibliographical references, and in order to you to get my details and get the references, Professor Barros can give you the manuscript. He and I am preparing to print this manuscript as an article, but you can have it as a manuscript after this presentation. Yes. My introduction is, what do you need to learn? I don't know so much about you, but I know about information science and information professionals, and I assume that you are going to educate yourself to work with information as an information specialist in some way. And what should you know in order to work as an information specialist? I think that there are many practical things you should be able to do. You should be able to understand different languages, of course, English and Portuguese, and you should be able to do online searches. So you should have knowledge about databases and how they are composed, and about different search strategies, and the benefit and drawbacks of Google in compared with traditional databases and so on. But today I will focus on more deeper things related to domain analysis. Recently, I published together with Jonathan Ferner a paper about the Library of Congress subject headings. How many of you know the system Library of Congress subject headings?
Quem de vocês conhece o subject headings da Biblioteca do Congresso norte-americana?
You don't know it? Okay. You know the Library of Congress in Washington?
Vocês sabem da Biblioteca do tá.
So the Library of Congress in Washington is very prestigious, and they index a lot of books, and a lot of their indexing, and they're used not just for the Library of Congress itself, but they are used all over the world. So when the Library of Congress classify a book or index a book, other libraries around the world just use this indexing in order to make their users able to search books in their library catalogs. Also, in Denmark, I used to index and classify books at the Royal Library, but that is past. Nowadays, the Royal Library just import all the data it needs from the Library of Congress. And that means that the systems used by the Library of Congress, they are very much influencing the possibilities that you can use. And the Library of Congress is a very prestigious institution. So you should assume that the Library of Congress subject headings is a good system. It should be something that set the quality level for the world. But in the article I just referred to, I and Jonathan Ferner, we claim that it's a really bad system. It's in fact worse than nothing. It's not making it better for users to do information searching. It's making it worse. So if you're interested, you could get access to that article and see. So this is the background, that if the most influential systems today are bad, how should we improve them? And this is what I'm going to talk about today. And I still recommend you to look into this article if you're interested in for understanding the reason for changing the methodologies for making that kind of system. In the article, we suggested that there are two methods that would improve the Library of Congress subject headings. The one method is known as Facet analysis, and the other is domain analysis. Again, I would like to know if you have heard about Facet analysis. It's one of the most influential methodologies in library science for classifying for library classification systems. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is I want to compare facet analysis with domain analysis. So the title of my presentation now is Domain Analysis versus Facet Analysis. And I will first talk about facet analysis, which is older and better established than compared to domain analysis. And probably the Bliss Bibliographical Classifications second edition is the most professional and valuable classification designed according to the facet analytic methodology and the best general bibliographical classification available. That's my claim. So You know a lot of systems, the Dewey Decimal Classification and the Universal Decimal Classification, and I guess you know something about these kinds of systems. The Bliss Bibliographical Classification 2nd edition is being developed in England, and Van der Bruggen is the editor-in-chief now, and the only academic working on it. And I find that this system is the best of the existing systems. And why do I think that? Because it has a methodology, and it's well described. Also, in 1977, the first volume was printed, and that whole volume was a description of the methodology of how to make faceted classifications. And since that, a number of volumes have been published about different scientific disciplines. For example, one of chemistry, one of art, and a lot of others. And each of these volumes, they describe how they have done it, how they do it. So I think this is important, that it's so easy to make a classification system if you don't describe how you do it, and if you don't defend the methods you're using for doing it. Then nobody else, you cannot be professional in classifying and indexing and searching information if there's no described method on how that should be done. And therefore, I say that let me give it another example. In biology, for example, there has been in the last 40 years or so a discussion about the ways to classify living organisms, and some biologists they still use the Linnaean classification system, but others think that is obsolete. And when I go to a system like the Dewey Decimal Classification or the Universal, I cannot see if they follow one or another philosophy of how describing living organisms. The only thing I can see is that they are all totally obsolete. So I think that the facet analytic tradition, they have some logical principles that are very important. But I also think that that approach has some drawbacks, and that's of course where domain analysis come in. So I have claimed for some years that the facet analytic system is based on rationalism. That is, it's based on logic and on pure thinking, but it's not based on empirical studies. It's not based on philosophical studies, on cultural studies, or any of kinds of that. So I claim that the facet analytic tradition and the this bibliographical classification is strong in its logic, but weak in its empirical approach. So to illuminate the strong side, I will read a quotation from Jack Mills, who wrote about medicine. He said, "Medicine may be defined as a technology concerned with the actions taken by the human person to maintain their health and treat their illness, their sickness. The definition of the subject leads directly to the primary category, the defining entity, the person. And all the other categories are realized in relation to this. The categories disclosed are, and then he mentioned the facets of medicine. So first, there are the kinds of persons, whether they're females or males, young or old, or what kind of persons they are. The second facet is the parts of the persons, the anatomical and regional and physiological functional subsystems, such as neurological and circulatory systems. The third facet is the processes in the person, the normal physiology and the pathology. And the next facet is the operations acting on the person, health management or preventative action, diagnosis and therapeutic actions. And the last facet in medicine is agents of operations, the medical personnel, the instruments, the institutions, the hospitals, the health services, and so on. So, based on logical thinking, what is the essence of medicine? Mills provided a range of facets, and these facets are used to classify medicine, and they are used in the order I listed here. So the most important facet is the person, and the least important facet is the agent or operations. So every book is classified in order to this. So based on this, the Bliss classification system has produced, I can show it to you, a volume. This is the medical volume of the Bliss bibliographical classification. It's rather comprehensive, and it's very detailed. Also, it's very detailed. It's every single part of the body and every known diseases at the time it was made have a place in that classification. But my criticism comes to how. Also, when a faceted classification is made, then Bliss said the first step of developing a facet analytic classification is to assign all the terms constituting the vocabulary of the subject into a limited number of broad categories. So he assumes, Jack Mills, that we have a list of all the terms. And my question is, how do we get that? And I think that is that's not yet just easy. As if you take some textbooks, it depends very much on which, or handbooks or bibliographies. It depends very much on which you choose. Now I have a background in psychology. And in that field, it's extremely different. There's one encyclopedia of psychology that's totally different from another. No overlap in what they consider the basic concepts in psychology. But there is of course more consensus in medicine about what are the basic concepts, but still I think it's important to address the question. I quote I read a quote about how this volume was made as the empirical basis. The vocabulary of BC2 is determined by literary warrant, supplementing the evidence of current dictionaries, treatises, bibliography, etc. in each subject. For Class H medicine, a major standard has been available in form of the medical subject headings used by the National Library of Medicine in Washington. So, a few comments here. They say they use literary warrant. Do you know that expression? As a literary warrant means that when you have a term, there should be some literature about that term. You shouldn't just use terms about which there are no documents. But they don't describe how they have found, how they have used this literary warrant. Have they gone to one major medical library and seen what books they have? Or have they gone to some encyclopedias or some medical dictionaries? Or how have they established that literary warrant? So I think that's one of the problems, that literary warrant is very unclear unless you specify how you do it. And very often they don't specify how they do it. So if you have a single library like Library of Congress, it's more easy. In that case, literary warrant means that you have at least one book about the subject in that library if it's a book catalog. Then they say they use medical subject headings, and that's very impressive, because that's all the subject headings they used in the largest library of medicine in the world, based on article level. So that's really impressive that they use this. And that goes a little against what I said before, that they don't reveal their empirical sources. For in this case, they have revealed an important empirical source. But they say they used a lot of other sources, but they don't mention them concretely, so we cannot check them. My general comment here is that any source, also the medical subject headings, will always have bias and will always have some omissions. And if you don't consider this, you cannot take it into account in your construction of classification. So what's important for me and for domain analysis is to try to look at every source and try to identify its bias and its omission. And I'll return to that, because that has something to do with another claim I have, that in every domain of knowledge there are competing paradigms, and that classification made from one perspective or paradigm is different from classification made from another perspective of paradigms. So the important thing to do is, in any domain like medicine, to try to identify the major paradigms, and to identify different sources that should be represented in the classification. So the description of the sources used and reflections on how the empirical basis for classification influences it, and shows the clear difference between rationalism and an empiricist approach. So that's the reason I claim that facet analysis is rationalist. And an empiricist approach would be one that try to identify some representative terms and make a classification of them. And for example, this is done in bibliometrics. And in bibliometrics, all researchers know that it's really important if you use one or another sample and to discuss the samples you used in order to do empirical studies. Viguerie is another main figure in facet analysis, and I will read a quote about what he suggested about the empirical basis of facet analysis. He said, "This can be achieved only by a detailed examination of the literature of the field to be classified. It is useful to study systematically organized textbooks in which the general structure of the fields are apparent. Glossaries aid in a more refined formulation of the categories by means of definitions with respect to the apparent class. The examination of a collection of specific subjects, for example, an abstract journal in the field, brings to light the more detailed structure of the subject." Yeah. I think he overestimates that there is some structure that have a more and more fine-graded layer according to which sources are used. I would say that my experiences in many fields, and I will give more examples in the following, is that if you use different textbooks, there are different structures. And if you use different databases and so on, there are different kind of biases and so on. So my comment to Viguerie is that it should be obvious that such a list as he suggests may be best or not sufficient comprehensive. Viguerie does not consider that different textbooks, etc., often reveal different structures, perhaps even conflicting structures of a domain. And when I say that, I should hasten to add that there are differences in the consensus in different domains. So this problem is much worse in the social sciences than it is in the physical and chemical sciences. And in my paper, I have some references where you can read more detail about this. So what I'm saying, you may consider a little overtuned, but I think also as a general principle, it's worth considering that each domain may always have different paradigms and different theories that reflect the terminology and the classification. I have in my paper here another example from animals. Also, the Bliss bibliographical classification about animals is not yet finished and is not yet printed. But at the home page, you can see a draft from that classification, as a classification of all the animals in the world. And at that homepage, there is a reference to a source used Rothschild's book about classification of animals. I have it here. So when this bibliographical classification tool should classify animals, they used this book and only this book. And when we know today how much discussion there is about ways to classify animals, it's obvious, and I think it's also a problem that they only use this only book as a source. They only mentioned that as a source. And I wrote to Van der Broeden, as I mentioned before, the main editor today of it, and she has written that it is obsolete today, and you can see if you get the manuscript, you can see her email quote in that. So why do they only use one book? Because, in my opinion, what they should have used is one book about classification of birds, another book about the classification of fishes, another book about the classification of microorganisms, another book about the classification of mammals, and so on and so on. Because it's at that level that we have the most comprehensive knowledge and the most updated knowledge. A person who has to consider all of the biology cannot have the same detailed insight and understanding as that. But I think that this is this is one of the problems with knowledge organization, that we need access to more. We need much more work to be done with the details of the domains, and not just some overall considerings of the domain. Excuse me. So this was a section about facet analysis and about its lack, or its lacked, you could say, it's not very developed a methodology of empirical selection of terms. Now the third section is about domain analysis, and my claim is that domain analysis addresses some of the missing issues of facet analysis. It addresses the empirical, the historical, the philosophical, and the pragmatic issues. What do I mean with empirical? We have already considered that. If you have a list of terms to be classified, the empirical question is how to select those terms. The historical is important because it's related also to social and cultural issues, because different parts of the world may have different terms, and terminology is developing, and you should know about the status, the historical status of it. And the philosophical is related to, as I said, paradigms. What are the theories and the assumptions underlying it? And what do I mean by pragmatic issues? So if I claim that domain analysis consider the pragmatic issues of classification. Have you any idea of what pragmatic means?
Vocês têm ideia do que o pragmático significa? do ponto de vista da classificação aí. É isso que ele está perguntando. Sim? Sim. A Camila, com certeza, né, Camila?
More or less.
Okay, no answer. The pragmatic is also if you have things and classify them after what are they used for. For example, if you have kitchenware is a concept that classifies things according to what they're used for. You could classify kitchenware according to the material they consist of, or their size, but a pragmatic approach to classification looks at what it's used for. It's very much related to another word called functional approach. What's its function? So I consider the pragmatic approach very important for knowledge organization. And there have been a debate in the literature. I have claimed that facet analysis is rationalistic and not a pragmatic approach. But some other people have said, no, facet analysis is also pragmatic. And because, for example, this system here, they have many alternative classifications. So, for if one library prefer to found it more useful, they can choose the alternative. So why isn't that pragmatic? I say that it's not pragmatic because it has no pragmatic methodology. All their methodologies is how to logically arrange terms in a classification, but they have no methodology of studying the domains and what the classification are going to serve in that domain of knowledge. Yeah. So that's so these are aspects that I claim domain analysts focus much more about compared to facet analysis. And I claim that from a domain analytic perspective, a classification cannot be neutral. So I claim that there's no one best classification for all purposes. One classification will serve some people very good, but it will be at the cost of other interests, and so we really need to study those interests that the classification are going to serve. In the case of medicine, the quote by Mills that I gave for my working hypothesis is that Mills' example is based on a traditional reductionist biomedical model to which alternatives have been suggested. And I mentioned some of them later in this presentation. But I say at the same time that I don't think that my argument against this is very strong. So I prefer other examples in this presentation. So you see that there are different needs for medical classifications and for music classifications and for every kinds of classifications, and we need to consider which needs those classifications are meant to serve, because one classification cannot be neutral. It cannot serve all purposes equally. Is this surprising for you?
I hope not, Birger, but But there is some students here that actually thinking about this on their research. So I talk Camila because she's working with that. She's dealing with those sort of issues, dealing with law records and documents. So and doing the way a more pragmatic approach, let's say, or trying not to do a domain analysis of it. So yes.
So again, it's much more easy in the social sciences to demonstrate that a classification is not neutral.
Yes.
But I have ambitions. I have the ambition to prove that this is the case in all cases. And what is the hardest case you can think of?
I could say like physics, I guess, or
physics.
Yes, I think so.
And
I mean, there is some
in physics and chemistry, we have the periodical table. And my ambition is to show that the periodical table is not neutral, but and I have one example from geology, trying to show that geology needs an alternative periodical table. But I haven't written anything about this yet. But just to say that if I claim in general that no classification is ever neutral, I have to go to the hardest examples and try to work with them. What I can say is that there are still areas, even in the periodical table, which are discussed. There are some unsolved problems, but the real thing is to to try to demonstrate. Okay, another thing with the periodical example is that Mendeleev, who is famous for designing the first periodical system, he thought that all physical and chemical properties depended on their position in this system. If it's all of them, then clearly I have a difficult. But if it's only some of them, you may say, okay, but from some perspectives, those properties of physical, those physical and chemical properties, which are not depending on their position in the periodical system, they may be of interest for some people. And those people are not well served with the periodical system. So, but if you are very ambitious, you could try to help me solve this. But if you go to the social science and humanities, you will often find, and I will present some for you, more easily examples showing that different classifications reflect different needs and interests and so on. I have a background in psychology, and in my paper here I have written something about psychology, but I think I will skip that for now because there's no reason for having too many examples. But my main example is from art studies. I had a colleague, Anders Hjørland, in Denmark. Unfortunately, he died too young, but he was very interested in art studies, and he taught art studies at the library school. And and he made compendia in Danish. And one day I traveled with him to Portugal, and he gave a presentation in Portuguese. And I say to him, "Dear Anders, I need very much to have an English text describing how art studies should be classified according to the domain analytic view. Couldn't you instead of focus only on Portuguese and Spanish and Danish, deliver a paper in English. And this was the final thing he did before he retired. So I was very lucky that I have that paper. And this is now published and you have access to it. And I have also mentioned it in my article about domain analysis in the Encyclopedia of Knowledge Organization. So what Anders did in that paper was to say that there are about 5 main views of art. And each of those views have different implications for classifications. So he demonstrated how these different views of art implied different classifications. But he didn't stop there. He also went to library classifications, the UDC and the Dewey and so on, and saw that these classifications, they reflected more or less some of those, so they were not neutral, they reflected more or less some of those views of art. So there is a principle, you could say, that different views of art implies different classification, and a given classification, say in libraries, or also correspond to a different use of art. There's no neutral ways of doing this. Unfortunately, Anders made one exception, claiming that there was a system that was not always neutral, because it was not related to any of the academic paradigms. I think I disagree with Anders on this, but I would need to make deep studies into art studies in order to claim this. But he claimed that the Library of Congress studies of arts was neutral. But I think that if it should be possible to demonstrate also in this case the theoretical bias of this system. Okay. The conclusion of this section of domain analysis is that the quest to select the empirical materials for classifying a field cannot be ignored. A basic assumption in domain analysis is that there are competing paradigms in all fields of knowledge, and that a knowledge of these is important for selecting sources as well as for defining concepts and deciding criteria for classification. And now I have a general conclusion. And my general conclusion is that outside of library and information science, classifications like this one is very little used. They're not used at all, I think, and they are very little reviewed. And recently, I had a mathematician interested in the philosophy and history of mathematics classification. He wrote a very good paper in the Encyclopedia of Knowledge Organization. And I asked him to look into this system, to the mathematical system, and try to describe it. But unfortunately, he didn't have time yet to do that. But I think that the point is that if we in library and information science and knowledge organizations make classifications of some domains or general classifications. They should be found useful, for example, for educational purposes, but that they are very little used. And what's the reason for that? And one person that is very famous in library and information science, that is Melville Dewey. Do you know him? Do you consider him a hero? Is he a hero of library and information science?
Ele é herói para biblioteconomia e ciência da informação?
Eu não peguei nem quem é quem ele citou.
O Dewey. O Dewey.
Ah.
É uma palavra complicada, né? Herói.
Eu sou arquivista, não vou me meter.
Because I can say, for me, he is the opposite. As two great persons in library classification were Melvin Dewey and Henry Bliss, and they are very different views on classification. And in my paper, I have cited a quote where Melvin Dewey acknowledged that library classification should not aim at being scientific precise or being based on it should not correspond to scientific knowledge at all. And I think that's a problem that has run up to these days that librarians. Also, much of there has been in knowledge organization an article about a library student who wrote a very fine article about biology classification and said that it has not been revised in 100 years and it's totally obsolete. And I think that's an influence from Dewey that we should not in library science, library and information science, try to follow, because then we have to revise the system all the ways and to update the systems. Whereas Henry Bliss said that a library classification would be most practical if it corresponded to scientific and educational consensus. So if there in a domain like medicine is a consensus of how things are classified, we in library and information science should take that consensus and use it. I think that Henry Bliss was a little over-optimistic about two things. He was a little over-optimistic about the degree of consensus in the sciences. And he was a little over-optimistic about his own. He made the whole system. The first edition of this was made by one man himself, all the fields of knowledge. And I think he was himself a little over-optimistic about the possibilities for him to discover the scientific consensus in all fields of knowledge. So as Dewey opinioned that a classification should only be a great series of pigeonholes in which to file papers. There need no it need not be correct or reflect an outer reality. And that's therefore Melvin Dewey is not my hero. So if library systems are not used very much outside librarianship, I think it's because they're not ambitious not to reflect updated knowledge as it looks in science and scholarship. And I think that if we could make more updated systems, there would be more. There would be more use for library and information science outside of our field itself. In the Encyclopedia of Knowledge Organization, I have invited different scholars, for example, an astronomer to write about astronomical classification. And it's my hope that if some in library science one day will update a library system, they will take his proposal and consider them and build on them. So I think that the important issue here is that we have to cooperate with subject specialists and with philosophers and with other scholars in order to develop updated classification systems. Okay, I will end it here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Birger, for all the provocations that you did for us today. So we probably have some questions from the students, and then we have also questions from the YouTube channel. So, alguém tem alguma questão para o Birger, assim, algum comentário? Não precisam ficar com medo, tá? A ideia da fala dele era essa fala exatamente como ele montou. Tem um pouco de uma provocação e um pouco como se fosse uma aula mesmo, né? Então, agora ele fez essa apresentação, ele relacionou a questão das facetas e, de certa forma, em oposição à análise de domínio, né? E aí um pouco, digamos assim, nesse contexto, análise de domínio, então, a análise de domínio olhando para os sistemas de conhecimento, para a ciência, enfim, de uma forma mais ampla, ou, na verdade, mais contextualizada dos sistemas dentro de domínios específicos, né? Não de domínios gerais, como a gente tem nas classificações gerais aí. E a gente sabe que não funciona.
Bom, eu vou tentar falar em inglês. Well, thank you, Professor, for your insights. And well, previous my graduation in archival science, I used it to study history. Mm-hmm. And well, for me, it was a little odd. When I became in this field, I became studying this field, this neutral discourse about the documents, or so I completely agree with you in this point. But my question is, well, how can we show with domain analysis? Because if we make some studies and go deeper in some fields or some areas or domains, it looks like, oh, is this vision or is this study, how can we go beyond? I mean, because it's so we go to many specializations or many classifications, and the interoperability is now a necessity of the modern world with the technology and all this. So it's I understand that we need this specialization and this other looks about something, but not only a universal vision of everything, but in the technology, how can we manage this? Okay, I don't know if you understand what I mean.
I'll try, and you can correct me. But before I start, I would say that since you are from history, since you have a background in history, I would say that the best book, one of the best books I have ever read is a book written by an American historian, and it's called That Noble Dream, the history of objectivity in the American historical profession. Do you know that book?
I don't know that book, but when I used to study history, this discussion about documents or history was always discussing the place of the one who looks for the history. And
yeah, so. But I think that if you have read that book about the development of historical thought, then you have some kind of background. Unfortunately, I'm not. I think this is really good book, really good. But I think he's too little pessimistic because he said that history started as a kind of fiction, a kind of storytelling, and it ended today as a kind of storytelling. And all the attempts to being scientific, gradual, he said that when they have the war in the United States, the Civil War, then it was difficult for historians to be neutral. So, and when they discussed slavery, the South the historian from the South states, they say slavery was a good thing, and when we have a historian from the North, they said slavery was a very bad thing. So how do you make a science to agree on anything if you have such difficult? So he also wrote that when the Jews came into history, American history, history was still neutral. But when the women and the blacks came into history, then history stopped to be a neutral history. So I think that based on a book like this, you can make your own vision of what is the field of history and what should it be, and then you can interpret the different sources you use based on that, and then make a classification that is not as naive as positivism, and not as perhaps as extremist as saying that history is just storytelling. You could find out your position in this and use that as to argue for the foundations of a classification. But then you asked me about technology.
No, I think you already answered, because we cannot go to extremes. We have to continue studying and going deeper, but not at the point that it becomes just another classification or another, but we can try to go to some consensus maybe.
Yeah. Both.
What I previously asked you is about interoperability.
What I say to you is, first of all, this: that if you have no background and if you are not read that book, you would probably make a very bad classification of history, but history research. But if you know that there are these different views and those struggles, you would be able to make a classification on a higher level, so a knowledge of philosophical problems in an area will improve that. That's my basic. If you only think of one method, for example, as facet analysis, say that a logical division is the main method and only stick to that, then you have a worse system than if you consider the philosophical tensions in each field of knowledge. And I think this is also important for. I have written an article in which I criticize the principles behind Google, and said that Google is based on principles in which the user's query is some matches are found to user's query, but what's also needed is kind of ontologies which are based on classifications of the world in order to give the most precise scientific information, and not just the documents best reflecting the user's queries.
Okay, thank you.
Obrigado, Marieta, pela pergunta. We have another question. I will translate. It's from Rafael. He is currently working in his PhD with social indexing, or he will go that way. But in the past, he worked with movies, and he's asking, it's very difficult to think about context in service on video on demand, like Netflix and all that. These companies, they use logarithms to approach the content based on relevance, and not the traditional way of gender or genres of movies and such. So you consider that these services that run records of music and books affect the idea of a more pragmatical view of classification?
Yeah, I think the best clue for me was social indexing. Also, this is related to tagging.
Yes.
So first, I would say that no algorithm is neutral. Again, if you will discover this, you have to have different. You have to know a domain, for example, history, and know different debates about how best to make epistemology of a domain. And if you don't know anything about epistemology and philosophy, then you will just take the most easy available material, and then you will make an algorithm working on this, and you will not discover that it's not neutral. So when I taught tagging, I said to my students, imagine that you have some books about women. And who are the taggers? Imagine that some of the taggers are conservative men, and some other taggers are the opposite. They are progressive women. I think that the tagging results would depend on which kind of taggers are overrepresented in the sample, and would it give any meaning to say that we should have a representative sample? Would it give any meaning to say that there is a neutral classification or tagging if conservative men and progressive women are equally represented? I think this is nonsense. So, in my opinion, there is no way out of, if we are studying things like tagging and algorithms based on internet pages and so on, we have to make some studies of which views are represented in those taggings and algorithms. Is this an answer to the question, you think?
Rafael, você já respondeu?
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So Birger, because of what Rafael talked about, I think idea that came to my mind right now, do you see any, let's say, way of, because of in domain analysis, we have a more, let's say, philosophical and let's say epistemological way of dealing with domains and what a domain is. Do you think, let's say, concepts that are now being used much, very much in the ways of, let's say, technological systems that deals with ontologies, they do a lot of what we call semantic approximation, and the other word would be relevance for this. What do you think those kind of systems that deals in a way they organize knowledge, they organize information based on, let's say, semantic approximation and relevance? What do you think of those systems that deal that? Because actually, right now, most of the systems that we deal with, thinks the ways of how they are constructed are based on that. They do logarithms to deal with relevance and try to do some semantic approximation based on ontologies. What do you think about that? Because when we look to domain analysis, we try to actually feel the way that domain is and how that domain works with the knowledge that domain creates. So what do you think about that?
But an ontology is just a kind of knowledge organization system, and it's depending again about the views and how they are developed. And I think that they would no ontology is ever neutral and can serve all interests. And the important thing is to analyze and say what purposes should this ontology serve, and again go into that. And when you mentioned relevance, again I would say relevance could be a subjective. You could ask the users, what do you consider relevant? But consider this. A student makes a paper and shows it to his professor. And the professor says, and the users have selected the titles in the library that she felt was most relevant for her paper. And then the professor, you have missed an important perspective. These, and show her 5 books. These are very relevant for your topic. Then it's not the student's concept of or perception of relevance changes. So I think that nothing is as a relevance is tied to the theories in the mind of the users. So again, we have to work on epistemology and theory and philosophy always.
Okay, yeah, I totally agree with you. We have a question from YouTube. Hi, you already talked about the neutrality, but do you really think it does exist just a concept like an utopia of an horizon that reminds us where to go?
Please repeat.
You already talked about neutrality, but do you really think that does exist, or is just a concept like an utopia, an horizon that reminds us of where to go?
I talked about neutrality, but I said that no system could ever be neutral. So my utopia is to learn information specialist that a system is never neutral, and to be able to diagnose its biases in order to help users. I'll give you an example from my practice as a librarian. Many years ago, a psychology student, female, went to me because she would make a thesis about the premenstrual syndrome. And there is a huge psychological and medical literature of the premenstrual syndrome. So it's very, very easy to find information. And the biggest databases are PsycInfo and Medline. And if you go to those databases, it's easy to find. What I said to that user is, my expectation is that these two databases have a bias in the biomedical direction, and that this syndrome can be looked from a more cultural and social perspective, and that this perspective is better represented in a German database. So I recommended her to both make a search in the main databases and in the German databases. And she confirmed to me that this was right. So you see that there's no neutrality, but there is better or worse solutions. So if you are aware that these databases are not neutral, you are better. You are in a better position to help the users.
Okay. Any other question, I guess, from anyone?
I would like to say again that if you have some questions, you're welcome to write to Professor Barros, and he will forward them to me, and I'll be happy to answer them. And also, I will say again that my manuscript with many details, you're welcome to have a copy of that from Professor Barros.
Assim, se vocês quiserem perguntar alguma coisa, né, para vocês podem me perguntar por e-mail. Eu vou pedir para o Genilson pôr o meu e-mail, né? Eu vou pôr aqui no chat, e aí eu repasso para ele. O texto de hoje, na verdade, ele vai ser expandido, assim, né? E a gente vai publicar ele, vai encaminhar para uma revista da aula de hoje. A ideia é essa. Porque é um pouco assim, né? Concepções tradicionais atreladas à questão da classificação e à questão da organização, né? E as diferenças atreladas à análise do domínio, né? Então, quer dizer, porque a análise do domínio, quando a gente vai trabalhar com ela, a gente tem sempre uma perspectiva do ponto de vista do domínio, do ponto de vista da concepção daquele domínio, da epistemologia daquele domínio, os conhecimentos mais recentes, né, do domínio, enfim, né, é por aí mesmo, e é exatamente por isso que a fala dele vai nesse sentido. We have another question from the audience in the YouTube channel regarding the pragmatic perspective of knowledge organization systems. It's possible that the methodology of social terminology can ensure literary warrant for discovery of thematic representation of social context of use of terms in any domain that overcome non-neutrality. Do you understand? Do you want me to repeat? She's talking about the pragmatic perspective and the social terminology. Then with social terminology can ensure literary warrant and describe thematic representation of social context of use of the terms in any domain, and to that overcome the neutrality.
Again, I think there's no neutrality. And so what you should be able to do is that if you have a sample from social indexing or from tagging, or if you have a sample, you should look at the sample and say which perspectives are represented and which perspectives are not represented. But in order to make such an analysis, you must know about different positions in that domain. And I said that if in history I know a good book that really I found very helpful. In medicine, I looked today in order to find medical paradigms, and it's very difficult. There's a little about evidence-based medicine and debates about that, but it's not in social sciences. It's generally more easy to find the different perspectives. But my claim is that in all domains, even in the periodical systems, there are different ways of organizing information, and that these are not neutral, but that some ways of organizing will facilitate some users for some purposes and some interest, while other ways of organizing will do it otherwise. So no, I don't think that domain analysis based on social indexing can be neutral in any way.
Yes, probably on that we agree. There is no neutrality in anything that tries to be neutral, or will never overcome that. From the perspective that we'll probably deal on this course relating to discourse analysis, that's the main thing there is that nothing is neutral. Everything has an ideology. There is an ideological background on everything. So we pretty much agree on those terms. Eu só comentei que na perspectiva que a gente vai ter ao longo do curso, né, a gente vai nesse sentido que ele disse, né, que não existe neutralidade em qualquer coisa. Tudo existe uma bias ideológica, uma bias, mesmo no fato de a gente tentar, só do fato de a gente dizer que não é neutro, ou só do fato de a gente estabelecer ver uma né, essa questão ideológica, mas também a questão de que é fundamental que as classificações se baseiem, né, na perspectiva epistemológica, e que essa perspectiva epistemológica tenha diferentes visões, diferentes atores, enfim. Né? Não existe só uma visão a respeito de uma taxonomia atrelado aos pássaros. Né? Podem ter várias visões, tanto que a gente tem um monte de gente que trabalha com isso em relação à questão na biologia, enfim. Né? Então, só para citar um exemplo. Né? Acho que é isso. Não sei se tem mais alguém tem mais alguma pergunta. Eu acabei saindo do YouTube aqui agora. O celular apagou. But I guess that's it. Thank you, Birger, for your great talk. You record in the YouTube channel of our program, so everyone that didn't watch today can watch in the future. And to the students of the discipline, we will continue the discussions on the next week.
Okay. Thank you for listening. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye.